Very good morning to everybody, and a warm welcome to all my colleagues as well. I'm Dr. Kripa Shankar. I'm a consultant medical oncologist at Coimbatore, and the focus of my talk today is going to be on the biomarker testing in precision oncology. I'm going to be focusing only on test selection. How do you look at identifying the best test and the appropriate test as well? So I've just called it why, what, when, and how. So I'm going to take you through that. Before I begin, obviously, we all talk about being in the era of personalized medicine and precision medicine. And that is true, but how precise is actually the precision medicine that we practice today? And that's what we're going to look at in the future slides as well. And there's no one size fits all. Obviously, we've gone on to into the era of molecular profiling as well, and genetic tests for both the patient and the tumor as well, the pharmacogenomics as well, to determine exactly the drugs or the treatments that have the best chance of working. So is this something which is new? Apparently not, because we've had this for quite some time now. This began in the 70s as well with the approval of tamoxifen, where we know it's targeted against the estrogen receptor. So this is something which is probably like old wine, new wine in an old bottle. So we are now in the era of all the other new biomarkers that we have in the approved therapies, starting from breast cancer, right now evolving to the tumor agnostic therapy as well. We have different molecular targets which can be targeted by using targeted agents. And by tumor agnostic therapy is probably the one thing that's evolved, and you irrespective of this location of the tumor, just based on the molecular signatures alone, you're able to use drugs to actually effectively treat these patients. And pembrolizumab, like we all know, has an approval in MSI high tumors and also in TMB high tumors as well, tumor mutational burden being high. And apart from them, you have the NTRK fusion inhibitors, which are larotrectinib and entrectinib, which are also approved as part of tumor agnostic therapy. And then you have the RET inhibitors, which are approved in thyroid and in lung cancer as well. And you have selpercatinib based on the libretto study, and pralsetinib, which is approved based on the ARROW study as well. So what are the factors that actually go into picking up an ideal test? So I need to understand the indications for doing an ideal test, the platform on which it needs to be done, the ideal method or the assay that needs to be done. You need to understand whether it's actually approved as a companion or a complementary test, and the difference between the two as well. And I would say the search is still on for the perfect biomarker, because there's still no one single perfect biomarker across the board for all the tumor types. And whether the test is actually predictive or prognostic, or is it both? And what are the clinical and the genomic risk factors also that need to be taken into account? Also, you look at factors like standardization, availability, the cost effectiveness, feasibility, and applicability in clinical practice. I think we need to look at all those factors before you actually look at ordering for a key test. And as far as the stages for developing a biomarker go, we start with the pre-analytic stage, then move on to the analytic, and then the final stage of interpretation. So what happens at the pre-analytic stage is that you have the source, and then you look at the molecular targets based on whether it's the DNA or the RNA or the protein. And then you look at the analysis, how it's being done through genomics or transcriptomics or proteomics, depending on the molecular target. And then you're looking at the output, and then it needs to be normalized. And then you're looking at having the biomarker. So these are the stages that go into developing a biomarker. And we've already heard from the prior speaker as to how the journey of a tissue begins, from biopsy to analysis. So biopsy usually happens with the surgeon, or any of the surgeons actually get the biopsy, the tissue out. And depending on the sample specimen, obviously it's then done onto a formalin fixed paraffin embedded block that we've already heard about. And based on your, like, let's say, for example, you're doing a polymerase chain reaction or a PCR, it can be done on a DNA, or if you're doing an RT-PCR, then you can use your RNA as well, which needs to be extracted. So, and again, sequencing can be done both on DNA and RNA as well. And if you're looking at doing a proteomics as well, then you're looking at identifying the protein. So I think that's something which is key for all of us to understand as well. So I'll move on to the topic per se. So I'm just going to be touching on a few aspects on breast cancer as well. So first thing is, we've all heard about the changes in the AJCC 8th edition, and a lot of us are actually excited as well. But do we think that it's actually practically feasible? And what about the role of genomic testing, and is it cost effective? So first thing, this is how it looks like. And I would say 100 marks to anybody who can actually remember this offhand without looking at it. And you add the genomic risk profile also, especially when you're talking about somebody with hormone receptor positive and node negative early breast cancer. This is just too complex, because it says if you have somebody with a high genomic risk, the genomic risk actually overrides the clinical risk. And they've made it mandatory to actually include the Oncotype DX as part of your staging system as well, which is definitely not feasible, especially in a low middle income country like India where we practice. So practical feasibility, I have my own doubts regarding that. And this is just a look at the indications for chemotherapy in early breast cancer. We all know about HER2 positive and triple negative, where it's more than 1 centimeter, you would definitely give 0.5 to 1. You would still consider giving chemotherapy. Any node positive early breast cancer, you would still give chemotherapy. What about the other indications? Well, a menopausal status, well, it's still, there's a lot of debate. Only you really wouldn't want to give chemotherapy only based on the menopausal status. And age also is no longer an indication for giving adjuvant chemotherapy in early breast cancer. Whereas grade, depending on the St. Gallen recommendation that's come out in 2019 as well, still remains an indication. But this last statement where, you know, the genomic risk actually overrides the clinical risk, not sure about that. Ideally, I think it should be a combination of both put together, the clinical risk and the genomic risk, which actually determines what treatment the patient gets. It cannot be just that the genomic risk alone can override the clinical risk. That's my take on this. And what about online tools? I'm sure all of us would have come across this, a lot of these online tools for actually decision making. So we have two. I mean, like, it's no longer. I mean, like, I know we have the Adjuvant Online and the Predict Plus, but it should probably be called the Adjuvant Offline right now because it's almost always offline. It's no longer online. But anyway, the Predict Plus from the NHS UK, that's still available and can be used. So remember that all these online tools are based on retrospective data. They're not based on any phase 3 randomized control studies. They're all put together based on retrospective studies. But if you do not have access to any other molecular tests, and if you're faced with a patient who sits across you in the clinic, and you need some sort of a decision making, clinical decision support system to actually aid in your decision making, then these tools are really helpful as far as that is concerned. They look at the age, the mode of detection, the size, the grade, the number of nodes involved, and then the ERPR and the HER2 status, along with the Ki67 as well. And they give you a 5 and a 10 year, they predict your 5 and 10 year survival and the benefit of additional chemotherapy along with hormones. So that's the role for online tools. And moving on to the TAILORx study, I think this was a study which actually led to the approval of Oncotype DX as well. So I think we need to look at what the reference genes are and the target genes are. We must remember that there are 5 reference genes and 16 target genes. And the question about whether it's prognostic or is it only predictive, well, it's a combination of both, and I'll show you why. So this was the TAILORx study. So it's TAILORx basically stands for trial assigning the individualized options for treatment. So that's the TAILORx study. So this is basically only in early breast cancer, and that to hormone receptor positive, HER2 negative, node negative early breast cancer. And this is a 21 gene risk recurrence score. So it's humanly impossible to remember all these genes, but what we can try and do is remember the headings, or at least remember the main genes. So the reference genes, like I had alluded to earlier, there are only 5. And as far as the other 16 genes are concerned, they are the genes which are involved in proliferation, invasion, HER2, and estrogen. So I think it's easier to remember it that way. And the rationale for the design of the TAILORx study was that about 50% of all breast cancers in the US are actually early breast cancers. And adjuvant chemotherapy actually is recommended to all of them. But how far would there be a statistically significant benefit? So I think most of the patients ultimately end up getting overtreated. So that was the basic rationale behind why the study was designed. So as far as the prognostic ability and the predictive ability of this test was concerned, this was validated in 2 large studies, the NSABP B14 and the NSABP B20 study. So the B14 looked at tamoxifen alone and showed that in patients with a low risk recurrence score, only hormonal therapy or endocrine therapy was alone good enough. Well, what must be remembered is when they started off, the recurrence scores, the cutoff was slightly different from what it is now. And I'll show you why as well as we move along. So earlier it was a low recurrence score was less than 18 and in 19 to 30, and more than 31 was what was considered as low, intermediate, and high risk recurrence scores. So what they did identify was the benefit of chemotherapy in this intermediate risk recurrence score of between 18 to 30, they were not sure of. So they wanted to look at the results from that. So eventually, like I said earlier, they had adjusted the recurrence scores from 18, they brought it down to 10, less than 10, 11 to 25, and more than 25. And that's how it stands for right now as well. So again, I think one of the reasons could be, obviously, even though the inclusion criteria excluded patients who had HER2 positive disease, if you look at the 21 gene assay which I showed you earlier, it did include genes which are involved in HER2 as well. And we all know that they have a higher risk of recurrence, and they would probably have a higher recurrence score as well. And that could skew the recurrence scores. And again, all these intermediate grade tumors, and especially about 1 to 2 centimeter in size, there were more of those tumors in the intermediate recurrence score group. So they were basically, the recurrence scores were adjusted to still, preserve for the prediction in the high risk group and also minimize the potential for under treatment. So, well, let's just illustrate that with a few case examples. We have a 36-year-old premenopausal lady, early breast cancer, T1N0, surgery done. It's a pathologically T1A, 0.5 centimeter lesion, IDC grade 2. ERPR is strong positive and HER2 is negative. So would you actually go ahead and do an Oncotype DX in this patient? And what about if the tumor size was 0.9 centimeters, grade 1, and more than 1 centimeter and grade 1? So let's look at that. So the NCCN recommends that anybody with 0.5 centimeter and intermediate to high grade, you could go ahead and order for an Oncotype DX. And that is based on the inclusion criteria for the TAILORx study. Well, as you can see here, they included only patients from 1 to 5 cent, more than 1 centimeter, and 0.5 to 1 centimeters were also included if they had intermediate or high grade, meaning grade 2 or grade 3. So if you had a patient, early breast cancer, hormone receptor positive, node negative, less than 0.5 centimeters, do not order for an Oncotype DX. And if it's more than 0.5 centimeters and grade 2 or 3, yes, you could definitely offer it. And more than 1 centimeter, irrespective of the grade, you can offer your Oncotype DX. So I think this is what the update on the TAILORx study that we had published as well recently. So we all knew what to do in the low risk recurrence score and the high risk recurrence score. So that was easy. Low recurrence score, obviously only hormonal therapy or endocrine therapy alone. And in the higher recurrence score, it was a combination of chemo and endocrine therapy. But in the mid recurrence scores, the randomization was between endocrine therapy alone or a combination of endocrine therapy with chemotherapy. And that's where we had the results as well. So these were the primary endpoints. And I want you to remember that the primary endpoints were different as far as the low risk and the intermediate risk recurrence scores were concerned. As far as the low risk recurrence score is concerned, it was distant recurrence free interval. And as far as the intermediate risk, it was invasive disease free survival. So what then is the difference? When you talk about invasive disease free survival, it takes into account all the above factors, which is distant recurrence, local regional recurrence, contralateral breast cancer, other secondary, and death. But when you talk about distant recurrence free interval, you're only talking about patients who went on and developed a distant recurrence. So I think that's key to understand that as well. So these were the results again in the intention to treat population in all the arms. So I just want you to focus on the 11 to 25. That's the intermediate risk recurrence score. So what you can see here is there was a less than or equal to 1% difference in all the endpoints, meaning your invasive disease-free survival or the distant recurrence-free interval, the recurrence-free interval, and even in the overall survival. So I think that's why they concluded saying that even in the intermediate risk recurrence scores, also endocrine therapy was as good. And with a few caveats, and I'll get to that a little bit more as we go along as well. Another case scenario. So this is another patient, a premenopausal lady, gained with early breast cancer, so upfront surgery done. This is a 2 centimeter lesion, grade 3. And again, you remember the age, she's 40 years, and the recurrence score is 18. So would the age actually change your decision making? And another same scenario, if the recurrence curve turns out to be 21, what would you do? Would you offer chemotherapy, and why would you do that? And if the age is 60, would that change? And what about doing the Oncotype DX in BRCA mutated individuals? Let's look at all this as we move along. So this was basically based on an exploratory subgroup analysis. Remember, this was not a predefined or a pre-specified. However, this was not adequately powered also to answer these questions. But having said that, yes, if you're less than 50 years of age, and if you have a recurrence score between 16 to 25, the magnitude of benefit was definitely slightly higher. And if you were to put a number to it, I would say it's about 2% fewer distant recurrences if you had a recurrence score of between 16 to 20 and less than 50 years of age. And 21 to 25, you had 6% fewer distant recurrences. So that would probably push you towards offering or discussing the options of adjuvant chemotherapy in somebody who's less than 50 years with a recurrence score of between 21 to 25. And so the predictive ability of the test was maintained in patients with a low risk recurrence score and also up to 15 in the intermediate risk recurrence score, where there was no benefit from chemotherapy, even if you're less than 50 years of age. So to conclude, again, the primary conclusions were in the intermediate recurrence score, it was non-inferior to chemotherapy. And again, age less than 50 years. And if you had a recurrence score between 15 to 25, yes, there was some benefit with chemotherapy. And the distant recurrences, the greatest benefit of lesser distant recurrences was in the age group of less than 50 and 21 to 25 with chemotherapy. And moving on to the question about BRCA, would you do it in BRCA individuals? Well, not really, because it hasn't been validated in those subset of patients. But however, if you have a patient who walks into you with a test, well, then good luck with that, because there are some retrospective data to show that, yes, again, the predictive ability was maintained even in those patients, but that is only retrospective data. We don't have any prospective data on the use of Oncotype DX in BRCA mutated individuals. And what about the distribution of the recurrence scores in clinical practice? Is it actually the same as that was seen in the studies? And what percentage of patients can you actually avoid chemotherapy by using an Oncotype DX with early breast cancer? And can it be used in node positive patients? I'll take you through that. So this is the distribution of the curves. Again, as you can see here, this mirrors whatever we've seen in the study and as far as in clinical practice. However, this is based on data from the Genomic Health Sciences Laboratory in the US. But what they've been able to show is it more or less mirrors that was what was seen in the study. And again, I think the key thing to remember is that about 70% of patients were able to avoid chemotherapy, especially we're talking about patients with hormone receptor positive, HER2 negative, node negative, early breast cancer. I think that's a very huge number. And again, in node negative, yes, it's already been validated. I mean, like based on the TAILORx study, but we have an ongoing study looking at its predictive ability and prognostic ability even in node positive patients. So we don't have the results yet from that study. So as of right now, the Oncotype DX cannot be used in patients who have node positive disease. And again, the other question that we've always been discussing, does the genomic risk always override the clinical risk? And should it be based on both the clinical and the genomic risk? And also, can it be used for deciding on the duration of hormonal therapy? So this was another update which we had on the TAILORx study, which looked at clubbing the clinical and the genomic risk together. So what they basically looked at was the clinical risk. They looked at the tumor size and the grade. So they said less than 1 centimeter, grade 3, or more than 2 centimeters, grade 2, and more than 3 centimeters, grade 1. So they took into account these three parameters and clubbed it along with the genomic risk. And they concluded by saying that obviously by adding this, they were able to improve on the prognostic ability and the predictive ability of the Oncotype DX test as well. So this was a lovely editorial again written by David J. Hunter and Longo. Again, they said the precision of evidence needed to practice precision medicine. And that I think that's very key to understand that even though, we talk about precision medicine and personalized medicine, and we're all in the era of personalized medicine, I think what's the key to even a test like Oncotype DX, a genomic test, which apparently looks perfect, is not, because it needs to account for the clinical risk factors as well. It's not good to only look at only the genomic risk factors. The clinical risk factors still stay important even in this era. So this is the other online tool that we have available, the clinical treatment score at 5 years, CTS5 score. So this again predicts those patients who can actually derive an advantage with 10 years of hormonal therapy as opposed to only stopping at 5. So here again, the parameters that were taken into account were the size, the grade, the age, and the nodal status. So again, the low, intermediate, and high risk, where they had less than 5% or a 5 to 10% and more than 10% distant recurrence risk. So you would justify in offering 10 years of hormonal therapy in somebody who had a higher risk based on the clinical treatment score at 5 years, CTS5. So moving on to the actual scenario in India, and what about the poor man's Oncotype DX? And is there an Indian version of Oncotype DX? So role of Ki67, can it be used instead of your IHC4? Well, we've already, we usually hear about this cutoff of about 14% that's been used in trials, and we about 20% as the cutoff for luminal A versus B. But remember, that's not an absolute substitute for IHC4, and I'll show you why in my next slide as well. And as far as the question about an Indian version of the Oncotype DX being available, yes, it's available. It's called the CAN Assist. It basically takes into account the clinical and the IHC based parameters. And that's where I think it scores over the Oncotype DX, even though there is no head-to-head comparison because it accounts for the clinical factors as well. And do you have an online tool for calculating the Oncotype DX based recurrence scores? Yes, and I'll show you that as well. So this is the IHC4 that I was talking about. This is a semi-quantitative information where it requires a different standardization. You look at the ERPR, the HER2, and the Ki67 put together. So it's semi-quantitative and also requires an algorithm. So it's not the same as using only ERPR HER2 alone and then adding a Ki67 to it. So it requires a different standardization. And so this is the Indian version of the Oncotype DX, if I were to put it this way. And the one key thing is obviously they took into account. So this has been developed by the OncoStem Diagnostics, and Dr. Manjari Bakery has done a lot of work on this. And again, they've looked at validating it in more than 1,000 samples. I think what is key here to understand is the clinical parameters also have been taken into account, which is the size, the grade, and the nodal status. And apart from that, they have the IHC markers as well, which is CD44, encadherin, and then the ATP binding cassette ABCC4 and 11, which actually predict for resistance to chemotherapy. So this only gives you whether it's a low risk or high risk, and yes, based on that, you could definitely use it in practice as well. And it's probably much more cost effective and much more easily doable in practice for us. So, but what about the real poor man's Oncotype DX? Like I said, is there an online tool? Yes, we have an online tool called the Maggie equation. This was developed from the UPMC or the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. And this takes into account the grade or the Nottingham score, or the Scarf Bloom Richardson score as well, and the Ki67, the tumor size, the H score, which is the histological score for ER and PR, the HER2 status. And based on this, they have developed 3 regression models. And at the end of the third regression model as well, they have actually compared it to patients who have had an Oncotype DX done, and the concordance rate is to the tune of 80%. So this is something which can be done, especially for clinicians who work closely with their pathologists. It can be easily done where you have an online tool for assessing your risk of recurrence as well. So just a brief word about MammaPrint as well. Is it both prognostic and predictive? And another case scenario, we have a 37-year-old premenopausal lady, again, early breast cancer, T2N1, MRM done. However, this is a node positive patient, a grade 2 tumor, and ERPR is positive. However, remember that this is a node positive patient, and you must remember the TAILORx study did not include patients who were node positive. However, the MammaPrint study included patients who were node positive as well. And they also included patients who are HER2 positive. And I'll just show you that as well. So this is based on the MINDAX study, which actually led to the approval of MammaPrint as well. So I think the key things that we need to remember are the clinical risk that was here used was again based on the adjuvant online. And the randomization was based on all these factors, the risk, the hormone receptor status, nodal involvement, age, and the axillary nodal status. So this is what I wanted to highlight. Here you can see that node positive patients, around 10% were also included. And again, HER2 positive patients, around again another 9%, and node positive around 29% were actually included in the study. So yeah, so just to illustrate that point again, that even though it may not be adequately powered enough to only look at that subset of patients, however, about around 20% had up to 3 positive nodes, and about 10% had HER2 positive disease as well. So if you're stuck in those cases with an early stage breast cancer, again, you could actually use MammaPrint over Oncotype DX in those scenarios. And these were all the permutations and combinations that you could have. I think it's very clear if you have low clinical risk and low genomic risk and high, you're very clear as far as the decision making is concerned. So where you're really stuck is if you have somebody with a low clinical and high genomic, or a high clinical and low genomic risk. And what the Oncotype DX has actually shown us, in patients with a high clinical risk, it can be used to actually, avoid chemotherapy in a subset of patients. So that's the only place where you can use MammaPrint. Can be used to avoid chemotherapy only in clinical high-risk patients. It cannot actually gauge the benefit from chemotherapy. And so that's one of the limitations with the MammaPrint, even though it gives you, I'll show you that as we move along as well. So here, there you saw the data with Oncotype DX, about 70% who can be avoided, but that's irrespective of the clinical risk. Here, you can use it only in patients who are at high clinical risk, and about half of them can be spared of the chemotherapy, about 46%. So again, this is how the interpretation actually stands. If you have it doesn't have an intermediate risk at all. It only has a low risk or a high risk. Low risk means you have a 1% chance that the cancer will recur within 5 years, and high risk means about 11% chance that the cancer will recur within 5 years. And this is an example of a MammaPrint result as well. This is how it looks like. So again, to compare and contrast, Oncotype DX is both prognostic and predictive. MammaPrint, not so. It doesn't predict for the benefit of chemotherapy. It's only prognostic. So it can be used only in the clinical high-risk scope. And apart from that, you have the Prosigna, the EndoPredict, the PAM50, and I would say the Can Assist as well, which is our Indian, I would say an Indian-based thing. And it's, called let's be vocal for local as well. So I think it's key to understand that it also includes the clinical risk criteria along with the IHC based biomarkers as well, and it's been validated as well. There are no head-on-head studies to compare between any of these two molecular tests. So just a brief mention about non-small cell lung carcinoma as well before we wind up. So we all know this is one of those hotspot markers. We always keep talking about a lot of tests being done for non-small cell lung adenocarcinoma. So I think the first thing is, how would you do it? Would you do it on single gene testing, multi-gene testing, or a liquid biopsy? And then just a brief look at PD-L1 testing, about what is a companion versus a complementary diagnostic test, and the TPS versus CPS score, and the various assays that are available for PD-L1 testing, and can they be used interchangeably. So we've seen non-small cell lung cancer evolve over a period of time from being just one disease to here where you're able to pick up any of these mutations, starting from EGFR, ALK, ROS, BRAF, HER2, and any of those mutations. And we know all these mutations can be targeted as well. So again, for biomarker testing, I think we must remember that bone biopsy actually is very suboptimal, because you'll have to, even after decalcification, if you're going to run molecular tests on that, your yield will be lesser because of the extraction of nucleic acids again. And again, for anybody with like adenocarcinoma lung, now you have an expanded profile where you have to run all these markers up front. So EGFR, ALK, ROS, BRAF, so you might run out of tissue. And I think that's really a key thing to take into account as well. So the concept of liquid biopsy already is something which we all know about as well, which basically looks at cell-free DNA, which is the DNA shed from tumor. So the advantages are that it's minimally invasive and can help you give a quicker yield as well, and you can run all your tests at one go. So I think single gene versus multi-gene, I'll show you the data for that as well in the next slide. I think the advantages are that you're usually, like we heard about in the previous talk as well, tissue being the issue. So if you're going to sequence it and do one test after the other, you're more likely to run out of tissue. But yeah, you'll have to look at the cost effectiveness as well. And so this was the NILE study, which was basically a non-invasive versus invasive lung cancer evaluation study, which looked at the Guardant 360 assay. And here they looked at only these 4 biomarkers, which is EGFR, ALK, ROS, and BRAF. And they proved that there was more than 90% concordance with the tissue. Well, as you can see here, when they started off with all these 4 biomarkers, by the time they reached BRAF, they were running out of tissue. I think that's one of those things which really we look into, because when they reach BRAF, it's only around 30% or 35% to be accurate. So I think that's one advantage which you have with the liquid biopsy or the Guardant 360 assay as well. And the turnaround times were also much quicker with the Guardant 360, about 1 week earlier. And more number of patients with biomarkers were actually detected with doing a liquid biopsy or the NILE Guardant 360 assay, which was around 85 versus 65%. And moving on to just a bit about immunotherapy and the biomarkers that we have, we've heard about all these biomarkers as a response to immunotherapy, being the immune cell infiltration, TIL, STAMs, PD-L1 expression, then high tumor mutational burden, clonality as well. So as far as testing for PD-L1 is concerned, I think all these molecules are approved by the FDA along with companion diagnostic testing. And here we talk about TC, which is the tumor cell concentration alone, and then we talk about immune cell concentration, which is the IC concentration as well. So only for atezolizumab, if you look at all the approvals for atezolizumab, it's always based on the immune cell concentration. So why is that so? I will look at that. But before we actually get into that, there's something else which I wanted to highlight as well. So which is the tumor proportion score and the combined positive score. So we all know in lung cancer, we use only the tumor proportion score, whereas in all the other solid tumors, we actually use the combined positive score. So what is the difference? So the combined positive score actually looks at the surrounding cells, which are the tumor cells, lymphocytes, macrophages, and the surrounding stromal cells as well. So what happens is in lung cancer, because you can have a lot of alveolar macrophages, because if you were to use a combined positive score in lung cancer, you might have a falsely high PD-L1 expression. And for that reason, you would prefer doing it. And that's why all the approvals for lung cancer are still using the tumor proportion score, where you're only looking at the osteotumor cells and not looking at the surrounding cells. So these are the companion diagnostic testings which are actually approved by the FDA. And as you can see here, it depends on the DACO or the Ventana platform. So the Ventana platform is basically the SP142 antibody and the SP263, whereas the DACO is the 28.8 and the 22C3 for Nivo and pembrolizumab respectively. So there was again another study called the Brooklyn 2 study, which looked at the concordance between all these 4 biomarkers. And they concluded by saying that apart from the SP142 antibody, all the other antibodies could be used interchangeably. The issue was with the staining of the SP142 on the tumor cells. So they said that the SP142 actually stains better on the immune cells, which is why for all the studies on atezolizumab, they've looked at only using the immune cell concentration. And it's also approved based on the IC concentration as well. So again, like I said earlier, based on the 2 studies that we've had, looking at all these 4 assays interchangeably, can they be used interchangeably? Apart from the SP142, all the others were practically equivalent. However, the SP142 had staining issues on the tumor cells, and hence the immune cell concentration alone was used. So with that, I'll conclude and say thank you all for your patient listening.
Thanks, Dr. Krupa. That was a very extensive talk, and it was fast, but however, a lot of information. So we can have the we can have a question
So we'll take the question
in the
on this
meantime
first.
and followed by question. Yeah. So, Dr. Krupa, you were just mentioning about the menopausal status in a HER2 positive disease. Any comments on that in a HER2 positive disease?
So yeah, I think menopausal status alone, as far as decision on adjuvant therapy, I think that's no longer, remains an indication for giving chemotherapy. So I think that's what I was trying to highlight as well. So as far as, your ovarian function suppression or, better pregnancy outcomes or all that is concerned, I think that really matters, your menopausal status, because we have data from the POEM study as well, where prevention of early menopause or you basically look at premature ovarian failure. You want to prevent that by using GnRH analogs. Yes, that still remains the case. Yes, definitely yes. But apart from that, as far as your decision on adjuvant therapy is concerned, menopausal status no longer remains an indication.
So I think next question you can see, I think what he means is in the triple negative breast cancer, how do you decide treatment, PD-L1, PD-1?
Yeah. So, as far as triple negative breast cancer is concerned, I know we are moving into the molecular subtypes of triple negative breast cancer. We've heard about the immunomodulatory subtypes, the mesenchymal subtypes, basal 1, basal 2, luminal subtype. And then you have, so that's where you're looking at. And as far as the immunomodulatory subset is concerned, I think that's where there is a definite role for immunotherapy. Even though, we talk about there being a role for immunotherapy in triple negative, I think even in triple negative, is the immunomodulatory subset which actually benefits the most. However, that's been done only on gene expression profiling in clinical studies. So, we really don't have access to gene expression profiling in clinical practice. But if you did have access to, that would really be, add to the information that you already have as well.
I think this you've already answered, that node positive is still in the research. So, okay, so you were just mentioning on non-oncotype DX tests. So what is the evidence we have for non-oncotype DX tests?
So again, for the non-oncotype DX, like for example, the MammaPrint or the Prosigna, the PAM50, EndoPredict, BCI, all these are also FDA approved tests which are based on studies. For example, the MammaPrint is based on the MINDAX study, which is again a phase 3 RCT, which has been done. So all of these are actually validated. But if you look at it, even our Indian version of Oncotype DX, like I showed you earlier, the CAN-ASSESS study, I think the one key thing here is that it actually accounts for the clinical risk factors and uses a IHC based and a deep machine learning as well. So I think that's where, I would probably say it scores over even the Oncotype DX because it takes into account the clinical risk factors as well. And obviously it's much more cost effective and the turnaround time is much better as well.